Miss Marple and the Lantern in the Bell Tower. Before we begin, thank you for being with us tonight. I'm your host, Allie. And isn't it wonderful how these mysteries connect us from all corners of the world? Leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, let's return to unraveling this mystery. Chapter 1. The light behind the Louvres dot the vicarage drawing room held that particular chill of late autumn evenings when the fire had burned low, and the lamplight seemed to gather itself into small pools of warmth. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner chair, her knitting needles clicking in a gentle rhythm as she listened to the animated discussion around the mahogany table where the church fete committee had spread their papers and plans. "The thing is," Lady Bantry was saying, adjusting her reading glasses to peer at a list, "we simply must have better organization this year. Last year's tombola was an absolute shambles." Mrs. Griselda Clement, the vicar's wife, looked up from her notes with a slightly harassed expression. "I do think we managed quite well considering the rain, and we did raise nearly £30 more than the previous year." The Reverend Leonard Clement nodded approvingly from his position by the fireplace, where he was attempting to coax more life from the dying coals. "Indeed, my dear, the parish funds are in desperate need, particularly with the repairs needed to the church tower." It was at this mention of the tower that the conversation took an unexpected turn toward the very subject that would, within a matter of days, prove so tragically significant. "Speaking of the tower," said Major Oswald Waring, the church warden, setting down his teacup with military precision, "I've been meaning to discuss the bell practice schedule. We've had some confusion lately about when the ringers are to have access." Major Waring was a man of perhaps 60, with the upright bearing and clipped speech of his former profession in the Royal Engineers. His gray mustache was trimmed to regulation length, and his eyes held the sharp attention of one accustomed to command. He'd been churchwarden for 5 years now, managing the practical affairs of St. Mary Mead's parish church with the same efficiency he had once brought to military engineering projects. "There's one rule that must be absolutely observed," he continued, fixing each member of the committee with his steady gaze. "No lanterns or candles are to be taken into the belfry. Ever. It's a rule we established during the war years, and it served us well. Those ropes are treated with tar. The sallies are moth-proofed, and open flame simply doesn't mix with such materials." Mr. Leonard Drayton, the church organist, looked up from where he had been making precise notes in a leather-bound diary. He was a thin, scholarly man with pale hands that spoke of years at the keyboard, and he possessed the slightly superior air of one who considered himself the musical authority of the parish. "Quite right, Major," he said in his precise voice, "though I must say the lighting in the ringing chamber is rather poor for evening practices. Perhaps we might consider installing electric bulbs." "In due time," Major Waring replied curtly. "These things require proper planning and adequate funds." From across the room came a sniff of disapproval. Miss Ethel Cray, the choir mistress, had been listening with the sharp attention she usually reserved for detecting flat notes among her sopranos. She was a woman of rigid principles and strongly held opinions, particularly regarding what she termed unnecessary innovations in church matters. "I should hope," she said in her crisp voice, "that we won't be rushing into modernizations without proper consideration. The church has managed perfectly well for centuries without electric lights in the belfry." At that moment there came a gentle knock at the drawing-room door, and Ephraim Potley, the elderly verger, appeared in the doorway. He was a nervous, bird-like man who had served the church faithfully for nearly 40 years, though he had developed an increasing reluctance to climb the steep stone steps to the bell tower in recent years. "Begging your pardon, Vicar," he said, wringing his hand slightly. But I wanted to confirm about the tower key. Major Waring, sir, you'll be wanting it after the meeting for the inspection tomorrow morning. Yes, Potley. The usual arrangement. Lock up as normal tonight and I'll collect the key from the vestry press in the morning. Very good, sir. Though I must say, those tower steps do give me considerable difficulty these days. Perhaps— Nonsense, Potley. Major Waring interrupted with characteristic briskness. A bit of exercise never hurt anyone. The day you can't manage those steps is the day you should consider retirement. The verger's face flushed slightly, but he merely nodded and withdrew, closing the door quietly behind him. Really, Oswald? Murmured Lady Bantry. The poor man is past 70. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who was admitted by the maid with the information that he had something rather urgent to discuss with the committee. Inspector Slack was a man of middle height, with a permanently suspicious expression, as though he expected everyone he met to be concealing some minor criminal activity. "Good evening, all," he said, declining the offer of tea. "I won't keep you long, but I felt it necessary to warn you about some recent irregularities in neighboring parishes. Several churches have reported thefts of valuable brass items, altar pieces, candlesticks, collection plates. Nothing enormous, but valuable enough to tempt a certain type of criminal." "How dreadful!" exclaimed Mrs. Clement. "Surely not in our area?" "I'm afraid crime recognizes no boundaries, ma'am. I particularly wanted to mention it tonight because I understand you have a visitor in the village who's been showing considerable interest in church valuables." Major Waring frowned. "You mean Pike? Roland Pike, the antiquarian from London? He's here on a perfectly legitimate consultation about the Sanctus bell. I arranged it myself." "I'm sure you did, sir. Nevertheless, I'd appreciate it if everyone could keep an eye on things. These London dealers sometimes have flexible ideas about ownership and proper procedures." As if summoned by the mention of his name, there came another knock at the door, and Pike himself was announced. He was a man of perhaps 45, well-dressed, but with something slightly predatory in his manner. His eyes had an uncomfortable way of cataloging and evaluating everything they fell upon, as though mentally calculating its worth. "So sorry to interrupt," he said with practiced charm, "but I wondered if it might be possible to arrange access to the tower tomorrow. I'd like to examine the Sanctus bell in proper daylight, and perhaps take some photographs for the conservation report." Major Waring consulted his pocket watch. "Certainly. Shall we say 10 o'clock? I'll meet you at the church." "Perfect," Pike replied, though his gaze had wandered to the silver tea service with unmistakable interest after Pike had departed, and Inspector Slack had taken his leave with further warnings about vigilance. The committee gradually dispersed into the cool autumn night. Miss Marple accepted Lady Bantry's offer of a lift home, and they made their way slowly through the village in Lady Bantry's motor car. It was as they passed the church that both ladies noticed it, the unmistakable yellow glow moving behind the wooden louvres of the bell tower, visible as a shifting light that appeared and disappeared as though someone was walking about with a lantern. "How odd," murmured Lady Bantry, slowing the car. "I thought Major Waring said there was no practice tonight, and didn't he make rather a point about no lights in the Belfry?" Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, but her keen blue eyes remained fixed on the tower. The light moved again, paused, then vanished altogether. "Very odd indeed," she agreed quietly. "And on a night when we've been discussing church thefts and valuable bells, I find myself wondering who might have business in that tower after hours." As they drove on through the sleeping village, neither lady could have imagined that within 24 hours, that mysterious light would prove to be connected to something far more sinister than mere theft, something that would require all of Miss Marple's considerable experience with human nature to unravel. Chapter 2. An Unauthorized Peal at Midnight. The morning after the committee meeting dawned gray and misty, with that particular dampness that seems to seep into one's bones during the final weeks of autumn. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her habit, and was tending to her garden when Mrs. Price from Rose Cottage hurried up the path with the breathless air of one bearing momentous news. "Oh, Miss Marple," she called out, quite forgetting the usual pleasantries. "You'll never guess what happened in the night. The most extraordinary thing." Miss Marple straightened slowly, her gardening gloves still earth-stained, and regarded her neighbor with patient interest. Mrs. Price was a woman much given to dramatic announcements, but there was something in her manner that suggested this was more than her usual village gossip. "Do tell me," Miss Marple said gently, leading the way toward her kitchen door. "You look as though you could use a cup of tea." "It was past midnight," Mrs. Price began, settling herself gratefully into a chair while Miss Marple put the kettle on. "I'd been up with the baby. He's cutting teeth, you know, and I was at the nursery window trying to get him settled when I heard it. The church bells. The church bells at midnight. Well, not exactly midnight, perhaps 10 minutes past or quarter. But Miss Marple, there was no practice scheduled. I know because my Herbert is one of the ringers, and he'd have mentioned it. And besides, it wasn't a proper peal at all. Just 3 heavy strokes at first, then a sort of uneven jangling, as though someone who didn't know what they were doing was pulling on the ropes." Miss Marple poured the tea thoughtfully. "How very curious. Did anyone else hear it?" "Oh, yes, indeed. I met Mrs. Baker at the post office just now, and she said her husband heard it too. Woke him from a sound sleep, she said. And old Mr. Redmonds from the end cottage mentioned it when I passed his gate. He said it sounded amateurish, like someone having a go who'd never handled a bell rope properly." This was indeed puzzling news, and Miss Marple found herself thinking of the mysterious light she and Lady Bantry had observed moving behind the Belfry Louvre. Could there be a connection? It seemed too much of a coincidence that on the very evening they had discussed church security and the strict rule about no lights in the bell tower, both an unauthorized light and an unauthorized peal should occur after. Mrs. Price had departed, considerably refreshed by tea and the satisfaction of having been the first to share her news. Miss Marple decided to take a constitutional that would quite naturally lead her past the church. She was not, she told herself, being unduly curious, merely taking the air, and perhaps offering her services if any assistance were needed with the morning's arrangements. As she walked down the lane, she encountered the Reverend Clement, emerging from the church vestry, his usually cheerful countenance somewhat troubled. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted her. "I don't suppose you heard anything unusual last night. Several of my parishioners have mentioned hearing the bells at a most irregular hour." "I'm afraid I sleep rather soundly," Miss Marple replied diplomatically, "but I have heard some mention of it. Most peculiar, surely." "Indeed, Major Waring is looking into the matter. He's examining the tower this morning, in fact, along with that antiquarian fellow Pike. Though, between you and me," the vicar lowered his voice slightly, "I'm not entirely comfortable with the amount of interest Pike seems to be taking in our church furnishings. Inspector Slack's warning yesterday evening has made me rather more cautious than usual." At that moment, Major Waring himself appeared around the corner of the church, his face bearing an expression of considerable annoyance, his military bearing seeming even more pronounced than usual, as though he were preparing to face an enemy, rather than merely investigate a minor parish mystery. "Clement," he called out briskly, "we need to discuss this bell business. And Miss Marple, good morning. I don't suppose you have any theories about midnight bell ringers?" "I'm afraid I'm quite at a loss," Miss Marple admitted, "though I understand several people heard it." "What time would you estimate the performance took place?" From what I can gather, somewhere between 10 minutes past midnight and quarter past. 3 heavy strikes first, then what sounds like amateur fumbling with the ropes. The question is who had access to the tower and why. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Leonard Drayton, the organist, who was walking across the churchyard with his characteristic precise stride. His pale hands clutched a leather music case, and his thin face wore an expression of mild irritation. "Major Waring," he called out, "I've been examining the organ bellows this morning, and I must tell you that someone has been in the church overnight. There are muddy footprints near the instrument, and I'm quite certain I left everything in perfect order yesterday evening." "Footprints?" Major Waring's eyebrows rose sharply. "What sort of footprints?" "Large, I should say. A man's boots, certainly. And they lead toward the tower door." This information cast a new and more serious light on the midnight mystery. Major Waring's expression grew grimmer, and even the Reverend Clement looked genuinely concerned. "We'd better have a look at the ringing chamber," Major Waring decided. "Drayton, you're welcome to come along if you wish. Your knowledge of the bell mechanisms might be useful." As the small group made their way toward the tower door, Miss Marple noticed several other details that struck her as potentially significant. Ephraim Potley, the elderly verger, was approaching from the direction of his cottage, moving with even more than his usual nervous haste. His face wore an expression of considerable anxiety, and he kept glancing toward the tower as though it held some particular dread for him. Additionally, she observed that Roland Pike was nowhere to be seen, despite Major Waring's earlier mention that he was to examine the Sanctus bell this morning. For a man supposedly eager to conduct his antiquarian research, his absence seemed curious. "Potley," Major Waring called out as the verger approached, "did you lock the tower door securely last night?" "Oh, yes, sir," Potley replied, his voice slightly breathless from hurry or nervousness. "Locked it myself at 9. Just as always. Checked it twice, I did, and the key went back on its proper hook in the vestry press just as you instructed." "And you heard nothing unusual during the night?" "Nothing, sir. Though I must confess I take a sleeping draught most evenings. Doctor's orders for my nerves. I wouldn't hear cannon fire once I've taken my medicine." As they reached the heavy oak door that led to the tower stairs, Major Waring produced a large iron key from his pocket. "I collected this from the vestry press not 20 minutes ago," he explained. Everything appeared to be in order. The door swung open with its characteristic creak, revealing the narrow stone staircase that wound upward into the dim recesses of the tower. The air that met them was cold and slightly musty, with undertones of ancient stone, rope fiber, and something else. Something that Miss Marple's acute senses identified as the lingering ghost of candle smoke. "After you, gentlemen," she said quietly, but her sharp eyes were already taking note of small details that might prove significant. A few crumbs of what looked like tallow on the third step, where they would catch any slight draft from above. A faint but distinct aroma that spoke of recent human presence in a space that should have been empty and undisturbed. As they began their ascent toward the ringing chamber, Miss Marple found herself wondering what they would discover when they reached the top. In her considerable experience of village mysteries, she had learned that when ordinary people began behaving in extraordinary ways, particularly in the middle of the night, it usually meant that something far more serious than mere mischief was afoot. The stone steps were steep and narrow, designed in an age when bell ringers were presumably more agile than the present day allowed. As they climbed, the sound of their footsteps seemed to echo strangely in the confined space, and Miss Marple noticed that the echo seemed to linger just a moment too long, as though the tower itself were holding its breath in anticipation of what they might find above. Chapter 3. The Verger's Key and the Tower Door. The climb to the ringing chamber seemed longer than usual, perhaps because of the tension that had settled over the small group like a heavy cloak. Major Waring led the way with military determination, followed by the Reverend Clement, then Drayton, with Miss Marple bringing up the rear, her keen eyes noting every detail of their ascent. The narrow windows set into the thick stone walls cast pale rectangles of morning light across the worn steps. But these only served to emphasize the shadows that pulled in the corners and turns of the spiral staircase. The air grew noticeably colder as they climbed, and that faint but persistent odor of extinguished candles grew stronger. "I must say," puffed the Reverend Clement, pausing to catch his breath at the first landing, "these steps seem steeper every time I climb them. I quite sympathize with poor Potley's reluctance." "Nonsense," replied Major Waring curtly, though he too had paused. "It's simply a matter of keeping oneself in proper condition." They continued upward, past the clock mechanism with its complex arrangement of weights and pendulums, past the small chamber where the bell ropes emerged through holes in the ceiling. Above, finally, they reached the ringing chamber itself, that circular room where the bell ropes hung in their ancient pattern, each rope terminating in its colorful woolen sally. Major Waring pushed open the door to the ringing chamber and immediately stopped short. The others crowded behind him, and there was a collective intake of breath at what they saw. Roland Pike lay crumpled on the wooden floor near the tenor bell rope, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. A dark stain had spread beneath his skull, and his London clothes were disheveled and dusty. Near his body lay the splintered remains of what appeared to be a wooden bell stay, its broken end darkly stained. "Good heavens," whispered the Reverend Clement, his face pale with shock. Major Waring had immediately taken charge, his military training asserting itself in the crisis. "Nobody touch anything," he commanded sharply. "Clement, you'd better send for Inspector Slack at once. Drayton, guard the door. Miss Marple, perhaps you'd be good enough to ensure that Potley doesn't come up here until the inspector arrives." But Miss Marple was already moving carefully around the edge of the chamber, her sharp eyes taking in details that the others, in their shock, might have missed. She was careful not to disturb anything, but her years of observation had taught her that first impressions of the scene were often the most valuable. "How very curious," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. "What's curious?" Major Waring demanded, his voice strained. "Well, several things, really. For instance, there's no sign that poor Mr. Pike fell from any height. Yet that broken stay suggests considerable force was applied to it. And look here," she pointed delicately with her umbrella tip. "There's rope resin on his sleeve, but it's in the wrong place entirely. If he'd been pulling on that rope in the normal way, the resin would be on his palms, not his upper arm." Drayton had moved closer to examine the bell ropes themselves. "I say," he called out, "this is most peculiar. Someone's applied fresh rosin to the tenor bell sally, but it's been rubbed far too high up. No proper bell ringer would grip the rope there. It would be completely impractical." Major Waring was examining the broken stay with a professional eye. "This has been deliberately weakened," he announced grimly. "These stays are made from seasoned ash. They don't simply break from normal use. Someone has damaged this one quite intentionally." The Reverend Clement had returned from dispatching a message to Inspector Slack, and he stood in the doorway looking thoroughly shaken. "I simply cannot understand it," he said. "What was Pike doing here in the middle of the night? And who could have done such a terrible thing?" Miss Marple had continued her careful examination of the chamber. On the stone ledge of one of the narrow windows, she discovered several small waxy crumbs that seemed quite fresh. She touched one delicately with her gloved finger and found it still slightly soft. "Major Waring," she said quietly. You mentioned yesterday evening that no candles were permitted in the Belfry. Yet these appear to be tallow drippings, and quite recent ones at that. Before Major Waring could respond, heavy footsteps on the stone stairs announced the arrival of Inspector Slack. He appeared in the doorway red-faced from his rapid climb, his notebook already in hand. Right then, he said briskly, taking in the scene with a practiced eye. I'll need everyone out of here except the deceased. This is now a crime scene, and I'll not have it contaminated further. As the group reluctantly descended the stairs, Inspector Slack began his preliminary examination. But it was not until they reached the vestry that the next significant discovery was made. Ephraim Potley, who had been hovering anxiously near the church entrance, approached Major Waring with evident distress. Begging your pardon, sir, he stammered, but I've just checked the vestry press and the tower key isn't there. What do you mean it isn't there? Major Waring's voice carried a dangerous edge. I collected it myself this morning from its proper hook. Yes, sir, I know, but I mean it isn't back there now. And, sir, I could have sworn I left it in your charge last night, just as you instructed. I distinctly remember handing it to you after locking up. Major Waring's face had gone quite pale. That's impossible, Potley. I never took the key from you last evening. I found it this morning hanging on its usual hook in the vestry press, exactly where you always leave it. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. If Potley was correct, and he had given the key to Major Waring the previous evening, then how had it found its way back to the vestry press? And if Major Waring was correct, and the key had been in its usual place all along, then how had someone gained access to the locked tower? Miss Marple spoke quietly into the silence. Perhaps we might examine the poor box. I noticed earlier that it seemed to have been disturbed. The poor box was an ancient wooden chest near the altar, reinforced with iron bands and secured with a heavy lock. Mrs. Clement, as treasurer of the hospital fund, possessed one of the keys, and she was summoned to open it. As the lid was raised, they all peered inside. Among the usual collection of coins and small donations, there at the bottom of the box lay the missing tower key. Well, I never, breathed Mrs. Clement. How on earth did it get in there? Miss Marple was examining the slot through which donations were normally posted. There's a fresh scratch here, she observed. Quite a deep one, as though something rather thick and stiff had been forced through at an awkward angle. And see here, there are a few threads of twine caught on the rough edge. Inspector Slack had rejoined them, and was taking careful notes of these developments. His expression had grown increasingly grim as the peculiarities of the case multiplied. Let me see if I understand this correctly, he said slowly. Pike was found dead in a locked tower. The key to that tower was discovered in a poor box, apparently posted through the donation slot. Someone rang the bells at midnight, though no practice was scheduled, and someone was moving about the belfry with a light, despite strict instructions against such behavior. He paused and looked around at the assembled group. I think it's quite clear that we're dealing with a deliberate murder, carefully planned and executed. The question is, which of you had both the opportunity and the motive to kill Roland Pike? The silence that followed this pronouncement was broken only by the ticking of the church clock and the distant sound of Inspector Slack's constable arriving to secure the scene. In that moment, Miss Marple noticed something else that struck her as significant. Major Waring's hands, normally so steady and controlled, had developed a slight tremor. Chapter 4. Rosin on the wrong Sally. The morning sun had climbed higher. By the time Inspector Slack permitted a more thorough examination of the bell tower, Though he maintained strict control over who might enter and what they might touch, Miss Marple had requested permission to accompany him, citing her earlier observations about the peculiar placement of the rosin, and the inspector, despite his usual skepticism of amateur assistants, had grudgingly agreed. "Mind you keep to what I tell you, Miss Marple," he warned as they climbed the stone steps once more. "This is a murder scene, not one of your garden parties." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Though I have found that murder, like gardening, often reveals its secrets to those who observe carefully and disturb as little as possible." In the ringing chamber, the body had been removed, leaving only chalk marks to indicate where Roland Pike had lain. The broken bell stay remained where it had fallen, and Inspector Slack was examining it with considerable interest. "Definitely. Used as a weapon," he muttered, making notes. "The staining on the end matches the wound pattern, and there are wood splinters in the victim's hair. But what I don't understand is how it came to be broken in the first place. These things are built to last." Miss Marple had moved to examine the bell wheels themselves, visible through the ceiling opening that allows the ropes to pass into the belfry above. "Inspector," she called softly, "might I trouble you to fetch Mr. Drayton? I believe his expertise with the bell mechanism would be valuable here." When Drayton arrived, somewhat out of breath from the climb, Miss Marple posed her question carefully. "Mr. Drayton, when you leave the bells after practice, are they normally left in the up position or down?" Drayton looked puzzled by the question. "Down, always down. It's the first rule of bell ringing. You never leave a bell balanced up overnight. It's dangerous. The slightest disturbance could set it swinging." "And yet," Miss Marple pointed delicately upward with her umbrella, "the tenor bell appears to be very nearly balanced. Look at the wheel, Inspector. Do you see that crescent-shaped mark of fresh wax on the rim? And there, caught on one of the spokes, is a strand of what appears to be very fine twine, slightly singed at the end." Inspector Slack climbed carefully onto a chair to examine the evidence more closely. "You're right," he admitted grudgingly. "There's definitely been some kind of contrivance attached to this wheel. But what purpose could it serve?" "Perhaps," suggested Miss Marple thoughtfully, "it might be wise to ask Mr. Drayton to demonstrate how a bell behaves when it's set just off balance." Drayton looked uncomfortable with the request. "It's not really safe, you understand. A bell that size, if it gets moving properly." "Just a gentle demonstration," Miss Marple encouraged. "Nothing vigorous." With obvious reluctance, Drayton adjusted the tenor rope until the great bell above was delicately poised. Then, with the slightest touch to the rope, he set it in motion. The effect was immediate and startling. The massive bell swung down with considerable force, sending a deep, resonant tone echoing through the tower and across the village. "Good Lord," exclaimed Inspector Slack. "One could hear that for miles." "Precisely," said Miss Marple, "and if someone had devised a method to release the bell at a predetermined time, using perhaps a candle burned to a certain point to sever a restraining cord, they could create the impression of bell ringing while being elsewhere entirely." Slack finished, his expression growing thoughtful. "But that would require considerable knowledge of the mechanism." As they descended from the tower, they encountered Lady Bantry in the churchyard, accompanied by Miss Ethel Cray, the choir mistress. Both ladies wore expressions of the deepest concern, though Miss Cray's was tempered by a certain grim satisfaction, as though recent events had confirmed her worst suspicions about modern innovations and London visitors. "Jane, my dear," Lady Bantry called out, "how absolutely dreadful this all is. That poor man, though I must say there was something rather unsettling about him. Did you notice how he kept examining our silver tea service with such calculating eyes?" Miss Cray nodded vigorously. I said from the beginning that no good would come of bringing outsiders to meddle with our church furnishings. The Sanctus Bell has hung safely in its place for 3 centuries. Why should it suddenly require the attention of some London dealer? Dealer? Inspector Slack's attention sharpened immediately. I understood Pike was here as a consultant on conservation matters. Conservation? Indeed, Miss Cray sniffed. I happened to overhear a most heated discussion between him and Major Waring yesterday evening right here in the churchyard. Pike kept using the word sale quite emphatically and mentioning sums of money that seemed far too substantial for mere restoration work. This information cast an entirely new light on Pike's presence in St. Mary Mead, and Inspector Slack made careful notes of Miss Cray's observations. Lady Bantry, meanwhile, had been studying the tower windows with a puzzled expression. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I've been wondering about that light we saw last night. It moved in such a peculiar way, appearing and disappearing behind the louvres, almost as though someone were deliberately trying to make it visible from below." "An excellent observation," Miss Marple agreed. "A person simply going about legitimate business would surely use a steady light and take the most direct route, but a moving light carefully positioned to be noticed suggests quite different intentions." Inspector Slack was becoming increasingly interested in these revelations. "Miss Cray, you mentioned objecting to Pike's involvement with the Sanctus Bell. Could you elaborate on that?" Miss Cray's stern features became even more rigid. He suggested removing it entirely, claimed it would be safer in the vestry while restoration work was carried out. Nonsense, of course. The bell has survived perfectly well where it is, and I told him so in no uncertain terms. Major Waring seemed surprisingly supportive of the idea, which struck me as most unlike him. He's usually so careful about preserving traditional arrangements. As the group discussed these matters, Miss Marple noticed Leonard Drayton approaching from the direction of the organ loft, his pale hands bearing fresh traces of the blue rosin used by bell ringers. However, when she observed him more closely, she noted something curious about his technique. "Mr. Drayton," she called out pleasantly, "I wonder if you might help settle a small dispute. Lady Bantry has forgotten how to tie a proper parcel knot, and I maintain that anyone with musical training would naturally tie neat, precise knots." Drayton looked somewhat surprised by the request, but obligingly demonstrated his method using a length of string from his pocket. The result was a hasty, uneven granny knot, quite at odds with the precise military-style reef knots they had observed on the singed twine from the bell wheel. "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Quite different techniques, one might say." As the afternoon wore on, various members of the parish community gathered to discuss the shocking events. Ephraim Potley appeared from the vestry, still looking thoroughly shaken, and carrying a packet of church candles for the altar. "Begging your pardon, Inspector," he said nervously, "but I've discovered something rather troubling. One of the sacristy candles is missing from this packet. They're counted carefully, you see, for inventory purposes, and there should be 12. There are only 11. "When did you last check the count?" Slack inquired. "Yesterday morning, when I prepared them for Sunday service. I'm quite certain the packet was complete then." Miss Cray had overheard this exchange. "I hope you're not suggesting that I took it," she said sharply. "Potley asked me yesterday if I had removed a candle to test wicks for the choir loft, but I assured him I had done no such thing." "Of course not," Potley stammered. "I merely thought perhaps—" "Really, this fuss over a single candle seems rather excessive," Major Waring interrupted with characteristic briskness. "We're hardly living in wartime rationing anymore. If someone needed a candle for legitimate purposes, I'm sure the parish can afford the loss." But Miss Marple had taken one of the remaining church candles from Potley's packet, and was examining it with considerable interest. She noted its particular composition, the way it burned with a distinctive smoky flame, and left characteristic crumbly residue quite unlike ordinary household candles. "Most illuminating," she said quietly, though whether she was referring to the candle's properties or to some larger understanding, none of the others could have said. Chapter 5. The poor box and the missing candle. The following morning brought with it a discovery that added yet another layer of complexity to an already puzzling case. Mrs. Clement had arrived early at the church to count the hospital fund collection before banking it, as was her weekly custom. Her cry of surprise from within the nave brought Inspector Slack hurrying from his examination of the tower stairs. "Inspector," she called, her voice carrying a note of bewilderment. "You really must see this." She stood before the ancient poor box, its heavy lid thrown back to reveal the collection of coins and small donations within. But nestled among the copper pennies and silver shillings, unmistakable in its dull iron distinctiveness, lay the tower key. "But this is quite impossible," Mrs. Clement protested. "I opened this box only yesterday morning for the midweek counting, and the key certainly wasn't there then. Besides, how could anyone possibly fit such a large key through that narrow slot?" Inspector Slack examined the donation slot with renewed interest. The opening was indeed narrow, designed to admit coins and folded banknotes, but nothing substantially larger. Yet there, precisely as Miss Marple had observed the previous day, was a fresh gouge in the wood, bright and clean against the centuries-old patina. "Someone's forced it through," he concluded grimly. "Look here. You can see where the metal is, scraped against the edges, and these threads of twine caught on the splinters suggest it wasn't simply dropped in, but lowered on some kind of string." Miss Marple, who had been examining the area around the poor box with her characteristic thoroughness, discovered something additional. Beneath the heavy chest, almost hidden in the shadows, lay a thin wooden stick about 18 inches long, with several strands of twine still knotted around one end. "How very ingenious," she murmured, holding up the improvised tool. "One could tie the key to the stick, lower it through the slot, then pull the stick back up. The key would fall free inside the box." "But why go to such elaborate lengths?" Mrs. Clement wondered. "Unless," suggested Miss Marple gently, "they wish to create the impression that the key had been securely locked away all along, while actually having used it for some unauthorized purpose." Inspector Slack was taking careful measurements and making notes. The implications were becoming increasingly clear. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to establish a false timeline, making it appear impossible that they could have had access to the tower when Pike was killed. It was at this moment that Ephraim Potley arrived for his morning duties, looking even more nervous and agitated than usual. His elderly hands shook as he attempted to light the altar candles, and he dropped his box of matches twice before successfully managing the task. "Potley," Inspector Slack called out, "I need you to think very carefully about yesterday evening. Are you absolutely certain you locked the tower door and returned the key to its proper place?" The old verger's face went quite pale. "Well, Inspector, that's just the trouble. I've been thinking about it all night, and I'm no longer certain of anything. You see, Major Waring did ask me for the key after the meeting. Said he wanted to make some arrangements for this morning's inspection, but then later when I was locking up, I could have sworn I saw it hanging on its hook in the vestry press." "So you're saying the key might have been returned between the time you gave it to Major Waring and the time you finished your evening duties?" "It's possible, sir, though I can't say for certain. These old eyes aren't what they used to be, especially in dim light." Major Waring, who had entered the church during this exchange, looked thunderstruck. Potla, you're confused. I never asked you for the key yesterday evening. I found it this morning in its usual place, exactly where you always leave it. The contradiction was stark and troubling. Either Potley's memory was failing him more seriously than anyone had realized, or someone was being deliberately misleading about the key's whereabouts. Miss Marple had been conducting her own quiet investigation of the sacristy where the altar candles were stored. She emerged with one of the thick tallow candles in her hand, having borrowed it with Mrs. Clement's permission for what she termed a small experiment. "I've been thinking about the missing candle," she announced to the assembled group. "Church candles are rather special, aren't they? Made from tallow rather than the paraffin wax used in household candles. They burn more slowly with a distinctive odor, and they leave those particular crumbly deposits we found on the tower stairs." Inspector Slack examined the candle she held. "Are you suggesting the missing candle was used to provide light in the belfry?" "Possibly, though I suspect its purpose might have been rather more specific than mere illumination. You see, tallow candles burn at a very predictable rate. An experienced person could calculate quite precisely how long it would take for the flame to reach a particular point." The implications of this observation were not lost on Inspector Slack. "You mean it could have been used as some sort of timing device?" "It's certainly possible. If one wished to create a mechanical effect at a predetermined time, say the release of a bell at midnight, one might use a candle burned to a specific length to sever a restraining cord." Leonard Drayton had joined their group and was listening with obvious interest. "That's quite ingenious, Miss Marple, though it would require considerable knowledge of both candle-burning rates and bell mechanics to work properly." "Indeed, someone with perhaps engineering experience and a methodical mind." Major Waring's face had grown quite rigid during this exchange. "If you're suggesting that I had anything to do with Pike's death, I must protest most vigorously. I was playing cards with the Clemens until well past midnight." "Of course," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I believe you mentioned needing to borrow some sealing wax from the vicarage yesterday evening. Such materials might be useful for securing twine to a bell wheel, mightn't they?" The silence that followed this observation was heavy with tension. Inspector Slack was taking careful notes, and his expression suggested that Major Waring had moved considerably higher on his list of suspects. Miss Ethel Cray, who had been listening from the vestry doorway, chose this moment to add her own contribution to the discussion. "I must say, Major, I did think it odd that you seemed so supportive of Pike's suggestion to remove the Sanctus bell. You've always been such a traditionalist about church matters." "The man was supposedly an expert," Waring replied curtly. "I saw no reason to question his professional judgment." "Even when that judgment involved considerable sums of money?" Miss Cray's tone was decidedly sharp. The accumulated weight of suspicion and contradictory statements was clearly taking its toll on Major Waring. His usual military bearing seemed less assured, and Miss Marple noticed that his hands, normally so steady, continued to show that slight tremor she'd observed the previous day. Chapter 6. A weight that rings without hands. Miss Marple's request to examine the bell tower equipment more thoroughly met with Inspector Slack's grudging approval, though he insisted on supervising her investigations personally. She had suggested that certain items mentioned in passing during their previous discussions might prove more significant than they had initially appeared. "I'm particularly interested in those handbell mufflers that Mr. Potley mentioned," she explained as they climbed the familiar stone stairs once more. "They're used during funeral services, I believe, to deaden the sound of the bells." Potla, who had been summoned to assist with locating the various pieces of equipment, nodded nervously. "Yes, miss. We keep them in the Belfry chamber wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from the damp, though I must say I haven't had occasion to fetch them down for some months now. The Belfry chamber, reached by an even steeper flight of stairs above the ringing room, was a cramped space filled with the massive bronze bells and their supporting framework. The air here was thick with the smell of ancient wood, metal polish, and rope oil. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light that filtered through the Louvre windows. Dot Potley located the mufflers in their storage place, but as he unwrapped the oiled cloth, his expression grew puzzled. "That's most peculiar," he muttered. "There should be a complete set here. But one of the leather mufflers is missing entirely. And this other one," he held up a circular pad of thick leather. "This one's quite damp, and there's grit embedded in the surface, as though it had been left somewhere exposed to the weather." Miss Marple examined the damp muffler carefully. "Inspector, would you mind holding this up to one of the Louvre openings? I have a theory about how it might have acquired this particular pattern of moisture and grit." When Inspector Slack complied, the leather pad fitted perfectly against the wooden slats of the Louvre, exactly as though it had been placed there, to muffle sound or perhaps to provide a stable surface for some other object. "Someone used this as a base for a lantern," Miss Marple concluded with satisfaction. "See how the grit pattern matches the spacing of the Louvre slats, and the dampness would be from the night air seeping through the gaps." Their investigation was interrupted by a metallic clatter from the ringing chamber below, followed by Major Waring's voice calling up to them with evident irritation. "What the devil is this coal scuttle doing here?" he demanded as they descended to rejoin him. "This is no place for household implements." The coal scuttle in question was a substantial iron vessel sitting incongruously beside the bell ropes. It was old but well maintained, with a capacity of perhaps 20 pounds of coal. "I brought that up last week," Major Waring continued, his tone becoming somewhat defensive. "I wanted to test whether the floorboards could support additional weight. We've been considering installing some new equipment, and I needed to ensure the structural integrity." Miss Marple examined the scuttle with interest, noting scratches on its rim and handle that suggested recent use. "How much would you estimate? This weighs when empty, Major?" "Perhaps 8 or 10 pounds. Why do you ask?" "Oh, merely curiosity, though I noticed there are some interesting marks on the tenor bell rope, just below where the Sally would normally hang, almost as though something heavy had been attached there and then removed." Inspector Slack was quick to spot the significance. "You mean someone might have used this as a counterweight, attached it to the bell rope to create some sort of mechanism?" "It's certainly possible," Miss Marple agreed. "A weight dropping suddenly would give quite a sharp jerk to the rope, wouldn't it? Enough perhaps to make even a large bell speak once or twice." Leonard Drayton, who had joined them during this discussion, looked thoughtful. "The physics would work," he admitted, "though you'd need to calculate the exact weight and drop distance to get the right effect. Too little, and the bell wouldn't ring at all. Too much, and you'd get a whole peal, rather than just a few strikes." "Precisely the sort of calculation," Miss Marple observed mildly, "that someone with engineering training might be capable of making." Major Waring's face had grown quite red. "If you're implying that I constructed some sort of contraption to ring the bells automatically, you're talking absolute nonsense. What possible reason would I have for such an elaborate deception?" It was at this moment that Lady Bantry's voice could be heard calling from the base of the tower stairs. She appeared presently, somewhat out of breath from the climb, carrying a wrapped parcel. "Jane, my dear," she puffed, "I do hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I felt I simply had to bring this to your attention. It's Major Waring's game bag. He left it at the vicarage last evening after the card party, and Griselda asked me to return it." She handed the leather bag to Major Waring, but not before Miss Marple had noticed something peculiar about the wrapped parcel visible at the top of the bag. The brown paper was slightly scorched at one corner, and there was a distinct aroma emanating from it that seemed oddly familiar. "If you don't mind my asking, Major," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "what have you got wrapped up there? It smells rather like bell grease." Major Waring's hands trembled slightly as he clutched the bag to his chest. "Just some parish items, nothing that would interest you." But Inspector Slack's official authority could not be so easily deflected. "I'm afraid I'll need to examine that parcel, sir. This is a murder investigation, and any potentially relevant evidence must be inspected." With obvious reluctance, Major Waring produced the parcel. When unwrapped, it revealed a small bronze fitting, ornately decorated, and clearly of considerable age. The accompanying letter on a London dealer's letterhead made for very interesting reading. "Regarding the Sanctus bell fittings you described," Inspector Slack read aloud, "I should be delighted to arrange discreet removal and sale. The price we discussed would be quite satisfactory for both parties, provided the transaction can be completed without unnecessary publicity or official documentation." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Major Waring seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds, his military bearing crumbling under the weight of exposure. "It wasn't supposed to end like this," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The parish funds were so desperately low, and Pike kept pressing for more money, threatening to expose everything if I didn't agree to his terms. I never meant for anyone to be hurt." But even as he made this admission, Miss Marple was studying the bronze fitting with a puzzled expression. Something about the entire situation still didn't quite fit together in her mind, and she had learned over the years to trust those small nagging doubts that suggested a deeper truth yet to be uncovered. Chapter 7. Tea in the vestry. The atmosphere in the vestry had grown considerably strained as Inspector Slack methodically gathered the various members of the parish community for what he termed a comprehensive review of alibis and circumstances. Mrs. Clement had kindly provided tea, though the china cups rattled rather more than usual in several pairs of hands. As the implications of Major Waring's admissions settled over the group. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the window, where the afternoon light fell most clearly, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm despite the tension that permeated the small room. She had found over the years that people often revealed more of themselves when they believed her attention was focused elsewhere. "Now then," Inspector Slack began, consulting his notebook with official gravity, "I want each of you to account for your movements yesterday evening from 9 o'clock onward. Major Waring, perhaps you'd begin." Major Waring had recovered some of his composure, though his military bearing remained noticeably diminished. "I left the tower key in the vestry press at 9 o'clock sharp, then proceeded directly to the vicarage for our weekly card game. The Reverend and Mrs. Clement can confirm that I arrived at 9:15 and remained until 12. "That's quite correct," confirmed the Reverend Clement. "We played bezique as is our custom. Major Waring was with us continuously until he departed to collect his hat from the hall." Mrs. Clement nodded agreement, though she looked troubled. "I do remember he asked to borrow some sealing wax for what he described as a parish parcel. That needed proper securing. We keep a stick of red wax in the writing desk for official correspondence." Miss Marple glanced up from her knitting with apparent casualness. "How interesting. And did Major Waring take the sealing wax with him when he left?" "Well, yes," Mrs. Clement replied uncertainly, "though I assumed he would return it the next morning." Inspector Slack made a careful note of this detail before turning his attention to Leonard Drayton. The organist sat rigidly upright in his chair, his pale hands clasped tightly together. "I spent the evening in the organ loft," Drayton stated precisely. I was cleaning the bellows mechanism, which requires considerable attention to detail. The work took me until approximately 11 o'clock, after which I returned home via the lane behind the church. Did anyone see you during this time? Inspector Slack inquired. I'm afraid not. The work required solitude and concentration, though I must say I heard absolutely no disturbance from the direction of the bell tower until the midnight striking, which struck me as most irregular. Miss Marple had noticed something curious about Drayton's appearance. Forgive me, Mr. Drayton, but I couldn't help observing that there's a smudge of coal dust on your cuff. Rather unusual for someone who's been working with organ mechanisms, wouldn't you say? Drayton glanced down at his sleeve with evident surprise. Good heavens, you're quite right. I can't imagine how that got there. Perhaps when I was adjusting the bellows housing, there are various mechanical components that might account for it. Of course, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, though her sharp eyes continued to study the organist's demeanor. Miss Ethel Cray spoke next, her voice carrying its usual note of stern disapproval. I spent the entire evening at home marking musical scores for Sunday service. I live alone, so I cannot provide witnesses, but my neighbors can confirm that my lights were burning until well past 11. And your opinion of Mr. Pike's activities in the parish? Inspector Slack prompted. Thoroughly objectionable, Miss Cray replied without hesitation. The man had no proper respect for tradition or established procedures. His constant suggestions about improvements and conservation measures struck me as highly suspicious, particularly given what we now know about his commercial interests. Ephraim Potley had been growing increasingly agitated during these proceedings, his elderly hands trembling as he attempted to manage his teacup. When Inspector Slack's attention turned to him, he nearly dropped the china entirely. I completed my evening duties by 9, he stammered, locked the main doors, checked the altar candles, and secured the tower entrance. I'm quite certain everything was properly fastened, though these old eyes, he trailed off uncertainly. And you heard nothing unusual during the night? Nothing. Whatsoever, Inspector. I take a sleeping draught prescribed by Dr. Haydock for my nerves. Once I've taken my medicine, I sleep very soundly indeed. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with sudden interest. Dr. Haydock's sleeping draughts are quite effective, aren't they? I believe my nephew Raymond once mentioned that they render one completely unconscious for at least 8 hours. Oh, yes, miss. Most reliable. I never stir once I've taken the proper dose. Inspector Slack was making comprehensive notes when Lady Bantry entered the vestry, looking somewhat flustered. Do forgive the interruption, she said breathlessly, but I've just had the most peculiar conversation with my gardener. He mentioned seeing someone walking in the churchyard quite late last evening, well after midnight. This information caused a stir of interest among the assembled group. Inspector Slack looked up sharply from his notebook. Did he recognize who it was? I'm afraid not. The figure was too distant and the light too poor, but he was quite certain about the time, as he'd been up with a sick cow and had noted the church clock striking 1. Major Waring had grown increasingly pale during this exchange. That's quite impossible, he said with false conviction. I was safely home and in bed by 1, having left the vicarage at 12. Yet you did mention needing to collect your hat, Miss Marple observed mildly. That would have required returning to the vicarage hall after initially departing, wouldn't it? Well, yes, but that took only a moment. Of course, though one might wonder why you didn't simply collect your hat before leaving the first time. The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken by Inspector Slack's announcement that he would be conducting a more thorough search of the church premises. As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple noticed that Major Waring lingered near the vestry press, his eyes fixed on the hook where the tower key normally hung. "Quite a mystery, isn't it?" she remarked conversationally. "All these comingings and goings, and yet poor Mr. Pike somehow ended up dead in a locked tower." "Indeed," Major Waring replied stiffly, "though I trust the inspector will soon identify the actual perpetrator." "Oh, I'm quite certain he will," Miss Marple agreed. "Truth has a way of emerging. Don't you think? Rather like a bell that's been set swinging, it continues to ring long after the initial force has been applied." As she gathered her knitting and prepared to leave, Miss Marple reflected on the curious inconsistencies that had emerged during the afternoon's questioning. Major Waring's nervousness was certainly suspicious, but there were other details that troubled her. A sleeping verger who would hear nothing, an organist with unexplained coal dust on his clothing, and the nagging sense that the mechanical arrangement she had theorized might require more precise knowledge than a retired engineer would necessarily possess. The truth, she felt certain, was rather more complex than Inspector Slack's current theory suggested. Chapter 8. Knots a gentleman shouldn't tie. The following morning brought one of those crisp autumn days when every detail of the landscape seemed etched with unusual clarity. Miss Marple had risen early and made her way to the church, where she found Inspector Slack already engaged in a methodical examination of the physical evidence that had been collected from the bell tower. "I've been thinking about those pieces of singed twine," she announced without preamble, settling herself on a pew where the morning light would allow her to observe his work clearly. "I believe they might tell us more about our culprit than we initially realized." Inspector Slack looked up from the evidence table he had arranged near the altar. "How so, Miss Marple? They're just bits of string burnt through by that candle contraption you theorized about." "Ah, but that's where you're mistaken, Inspector. They're not merely bits of string. They're examples of somebody's particular technique with knots. And in my experience, the way a person ties knots is as distinctive as their handwriting." She approached the table and examined the charred remains with careful attention. "Look here at this piece from the bell wheel. The knot that secured it is what seafaring men call a reef knot. Left over right, then right over left. It's been tied with considerable precision and drawn tight in the proper manner." Inspector Slack peered at the evidence with renewed interest. "And that tells us something significant." "Indeed it does. A reef knot is not something one learns accidentally. It requires specific instruction and considerable practice to tie correctly. Most people, when joining two pieces of rope or twine, will instinctively tie what's called a granny knot, which is far less secure but much easier to manage." Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of the Reverend Clement, who had come to prepare for morning prayers. He paused when he observed their examination of the evidence. "I say, that's rather a neat bit of rope work," he commented, glancing at the singed twine. "Reminds me of the knots Major Waring used to teach the scout troop when he was our local scoutmaster. He was most particular about proper technique. Always insisted that a gentleman should know how to tie a rope correctly." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. "How fascinating. And would you say that Major Waring's instruction was effective? Did the boys learn to tie such knots automatically?" "Oh, absolutely. He drilled them quite thoroughly. Said it was a matter of both practical utility and proper discipline. I remember him saying that sloppy knot work was a sign of sloppy thinking." This information seemed highly significant, and Inspector Slack made careful notes. However, Miss Marple was not yet satisfied with their investigation. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe it would be instructive to observe how our various suspects actually tie knots when they're not conscious of being tested. Might I suggest a small experiment?" When Leonard Drayton arrived for his morning practice at the organ, Miss Marple approached him with an apparently innocent request. Mr. Drayton, I wonder if you might help me with a small domestic problem. I've brought some items for the church jumble sale, but I'm having terrible difficulty securing this parcel properly. My arthritis, you know. Drayton obligingly took the string she offered and proceeded to tie the package. His technique was hasty and careless, resulting in the loose, uneven knot that Miss Marple had expected. When she asked him to demonstrate again, using a different method, he produced another granny knot, equally untidy. "Most interesting," she murmured. "Quite different from the methodical approach one might expect from a musician." Later, when Ephraim Potley arrived for his morning duties, she repeated the experiment. The elderly verger's fingers struggled with the string, producing knots that were functional but crude, clearly the work of someone whose manual dexterity was compromised by age and nervousness. Miss Ethel Cray, when presented with the same challenge, tied her knots with the same rigid precision she brought to all her activities. However, her technique was distinctly feminine, employing the methods typically taught in domestic situations rather than the specific maritime patterns favored by those with military or nautical training. It was when Major Waring appeared that the experiment became most revealing. Without thinking, he took the string and efficiently tied a perfect reef knot, his fingers moving with the automatic precision of long practice. When Miss Marple complimented his technique and asked for a demonstration of his method, he obligingly tied several more knots, each one identical in its professional competence. "Excellent work, Major," she observed, clearly the result of proper training. "Years of military service," he replied with a trace of his old pride. "We were taught that attention to detail in small matters prevented disasters in large ones." But as he spoke, Miss Marple noticed something curious. While Major Waring's reef knots were indeed perfectly executed, there was a subtle difference between his technique and the knots found on the evidence. His knots were tied with the mechanical precision of military training, but the singed twine from the bell wheel showed signs of having been tied under different circumstances, with more haste, perhaps, or under emotional stress. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, had been conducting his own investigations. He had retrieved additional evidence from Major Waring's cottage, including a coil of twine that appeared to match the material found in the bell tower. However, when he examined the way this twine had been finished and secured, he found the same discrepancy that Miss Marple had observed. "It's puzzling," he admitted to Miss Marple as they walked through the churchyard later that afternoon. "All the physical evidence seems to point toward Major Waring, yet something doesn't quite fit. The timing, for instance, if he was playing cards until 12. How could he have been in the bell tower at midnight to operate this contraption you've theorized?" "A very good point, Inspector. And there are other inconsistencies as well. The coal dust on Mr. Drayton's sleeve, for example. One doesn't acquire such staining from organ maintenance." They paused near the tower, where afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen across the ancient stones. Miss Marple tilted her head as though listening to something beyond the range of ordinary hearing. "You know, Inspector, I've been thinking about that midnight peal. Everyone has assumed that whoever arranged the mechanical device was present to operate it. But what if that assumption is incorrect? What if the true cleverness of the plan was that it allowed the murderer to be elsewhere entirely, establishing a perfect alibi while the bells rang to mark the supposed time of death?" The case was beginning to resolve itself in Miss Marple's mind with the clarity that came when all the scattered pieces finally formed a coherent picture. The midnight bells had indeed been made to lie, but not in the way anyone had initially suspected. The truth, as so often happened in matters of human nature, was both simpler and more complex than the obvious explanation suggested. Chapter 10. Evensong and the lantern put out. The setting sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows of St. Mary Mead Church as the evening service drew to its close. The familiar words of evensong had provided comfort to generations of parishioners. But on this particular evening, they carried an additional weight of solemnity as Inspector Slack prepared to conclude his investigation into the murder of Roland Pike. Miss Marple sat quietly in her accustomed pew, her prayer book open before her, though her attention was focused not on the liturgy, but on the final threads of evidence that would complete her understanding of the case. The Reverend Clement's voice carried clearly through the ancient nave as he pronounced the blessing, and gradually the congregation began to disperse into the gathering dusk. "Inspector Slack," Miss Marple said quietly as the last of the worshippers departed, "I believe the time has come to lay out the complete truth of this matter. But first, I think we should ensure that Major Waring understands he is not, after all, our primary suspect." Major Waring, who had been sitting rigidly throughout the service, looked up with a mixture of relief and bewilderment. "I confess I don't entirely follow your reasoning, Miss Marple, though I'm naturally grateful for any suggestion of my innocence." "Your innocence in the matter of murder, certainly," she replied gently, "though I fear your involvement in the proposed sale of church property will require some explanation to the parish council." Inspector Slack had positioned himself near the chancel, his notebook ready. "Miss Marple has convinced me that our understanding of this case requires considerable revision," he announced to the small group that remained. "The evidence we initially interpreted as pointing toward Major Waring actually tells quite a different story." Leonard Drayton had lingered after the service, ostensibly to secure the organ, but Miss Marple noticed that his usual precise movements had become nervous and hurried. His pale hands trembled slightly as he gathered his music, and there was something in his manner that suggested a man preparing for flight. "The fundamental error in our investigation," Miss Marple continued, "was in accepting the midnight bells as an accurate indicator of when Pike died. Once I realized that the bells had been deliberately made to ring at that time to establish a false timeline, the entire case took on a different complexion." She rose from her pew and moved toward the center of the nave, where her voice would carry clearly to all present. "Pike was killed much earlier that evening, probably between 9:15 and 9:30, by someone who had arranged to meet him in the tower under the pretext of discussing church matters." "But who had such access?" demanded Major Waring. "Someone who possessed intimate knowledge of both the church lighting and the bell mechanisms. Someone who could calculate precisely how long a tallow candle would take to burn down to a specific point. Someone who understood exactly how much mechanical force would be required to make the tenor bell respond to an artificial stimulus." Leonard Drayton had gone very pale, but he continued his pretense of organizing his musical materials. "I'm sure I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple." "I'm implying, Mr. Drayton, that your specialized knowledge made you uniquely qualified to construct the timing device that created our false midnight alibi. Your work with the organ bellows gave you understanding of weights and mechanical advantage. Your responsibility for the altar candles meant you knew their burning characteristics intimately, and your role as occasional substitute bell ringer provided you with detailed knowledge of how the bells respond to various stimuli." Inspector Slack had moved closer to Drayton, ready to prevent any attempted escape. "The coal dust on your clothing was the first indication, sir. Such staining comes from handling iron implements, not from organ maintenance. Furthermore," Miss Marple continued, "your knot-tying technique, while adequate for normal purposes, lacks the precision of military training. The reef knots found on the mechanism were tied under stress, probably in haste, which accounts for their slightly imperfect execution, despite their basic competence." Drayton's composure was beginning to crack. "This is all speculation and conjecture. You have no proof of any wrongdoing on my part." "On the contrary, we have considerable proof. Inspector Slack discovered the missing handbell muffler in your garden shed yesterday, still bearing traces of Louvre dust from where you positioned it to support your lantern. The light that Lady Bantry and I observed was deliberately arranged to be seen, creating the impression that someone was moving about the belfry at the time you were supposedly cleaning the organ. The organist's face had grown ashen, but he made one final attempt at denial. Even if that were true, what possible motive could I have had for killing Pike? Miss Marple's expression softened with something approaching pity. I believe Pike had discovered something about your past, Mr. Drayton, something that threatened your position here and your carefully constructed reputation. Pike was an experienced dealer in valuable items, with the sharp eye such men develop for detecting both valuable objects and vulnerable people. I suspect he recognized that your musical credentials were not entirely what they appeared to be. Inspector Slack produced a telegram from his pocket. We've received confirmation from the London College of Music, sir. They have no record of Leonard Drayton ever completing their certification program, despite the diploma hanging in your cottage. The signature has been rather skillfully forged. The revelation seemed to drain the last of Drayton's resistance. His shoulders sagged, and he sank onto one of the wooden chairs near the organ console. He was going to expose me, he said quietly. Pike recognized the forgery immediately when he visited my cottage. He'd seen similar work before, he said. He demanded money to keep silent, and when I couldn't pay what he asked, he threatened to inform the parish council immediately. So you arranged to meet him in the tower, Miss Marple said gently, ostensibly to show him additional valuable items that might satisfy his greed. I never meant to kill him, Drayton continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought, perhaps I could reason with him, find some other solution. But he laughed at me, said I was nothing but a fraud who'd been deceiving decent people for years. He said he'd enjoy watching me lose everything I'd worked to build. And in your anger, you struck him with the bell stay. It was already loose. I'd noticed it during my inspection of the mechanism earlier. It seemed to happen almost without conscious thought. One moment he was sneering at me, and the next, Inspector Slack stepped forward with his handcuffs. Leonard Drayton, I arrest you for the murder of Roland Pike. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence against you. As Drayton was led away, his confession having removed any doubt about his guilt, Miss Marple remained in the church for a few minutes longer. The ancient building seemed to exhale slowly in the gathering darkness, as though relieved to have its peace restored after the violence that had briefly disturbed its sanctity. Such an elaborate deception, murmured Lady Bantry, who had waited quietly through the dramatic conclusion. All those calculations and mechanical devices just to create their false alibi. Indeed, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, though I suspect the real tragedy lies not in the ingenuity of the crime, but in the desperation that drove a man to destroy his life rather than face the consequences of an old deception. As they walked together through the churchyard toward the village, the evening bells began their final call of the day. The sound carried clearly across St. Mary Mead, honest and true, marking the passage of time with the same reliability they had maintained for centuries. The bells, Miss Marple reflected, had been made to lie once, but they had ultimately revealed the truth. In her experience, that was often the way of things. Truth had a persistence that human deception could delay but never permanently defeat.